All right, we took a look last week at one normative theory, utilitarianism. We're taking a look this week at Kantian normative theory, or it's also called deontological normative theory. This term deontological or deontology comes from the Greek word for duty. There's a strong emphasis on moral duty in the Kantian moral philosophy. As Schaefer-Landau discusses in the early passages of this chapter, the Kantian perspective on morality is quite different from the utilitarian perspective on morality, quite different from what we saw in utilitarianism. We have two chapters for this week. The first one is the Kantian perspective, fairness and justice. And then later we'll turn to another chapter on the Kantian perspective subtitled autonomy and respect. So the 18th century moral philosopher Immanuel Kant and moral philosophers in this tradition attached great importance to such moral values as fairness, justice, again, autonomy, respect. And this does mark a contrast with utilitarianism, as we saw last time. One of the objections to utilitarianism is that there are lots of ways that you could maximize good consequences. There are lots of ways that you could bring about a greater balance of happiness over unhappiness. That would involve treating someone unfairly or violating someone's rights. So for this reason, a lot of people have found utilitarianism not believable, not a plausible normative theory. By way of contrast, the Kantian perspective says that fairness, that is to say, treating everyone fairly, justice, here again, treating everyone justly, that has to take precedence over good and bad considerations to do with consequences. Let me put it that way. The Kantian point of view is that no measure of good consequences could justify treating someone unfairly. So again, that's quite different from what we saw in utilitarianism. Again, the Kantian perspective is that no measure of good consequences could justify treating someone unjustly, violating someone's rights. For example, it can never be justified, according to the Kantian perspective, simply by the consideration, well, in this case, if we do it, then we could more people would be happy than unhappy. We could bring about a greater balance of happiness over unhappiness. In the Kantian perspective on morality, that is never an acceptable moral justification. So Schaefer-Landau starts off the chapter talking about the principle of universalizability. There is a strong emphasis in Kantian normative theory on this notion of universalizability. Schaefer-Landau, in a way, it's an old idea in moral philosophy. It's an old idea in ethics. In a way, it goes back to the Golden Rule, which, of course, is going back a long, long way. That's going back to the Bible, obviously. Schaefer-Landau starts off talking about the Golden Rule, and then he mentions some problems with it. The basic idea behind it, Kant thought is right. The basic idea behind it is the idea of universalizability, and Kant thinks that that is an important part of morality, but he thought that a principle that states how we are to act needs to be more precise than just the Golden Rule, because the Golden Rule says treat others the way that you would want to be treated. Well, that isn't, from Kant's point of view, that isn't a precise enough way of getting across the idea of universalizability. He thought that the basic idea behind that was basically correct, but it needed a more precise formulation, because it's not that hard to think of counterexamples to the Golden Rule. So Schaefer-Landau gives a counterexample early in the chapter that you can read. Another counterexample would be something like this. What if I'm a bank robber, and the way that I want others to treat me is to help me rob banks? Okay, so then I consult the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule says treat others the way you would want to be treated. Okay, well, the way that I want to be treated is I want others to help me rob banks. Therefore, the way I should treat others is to help others rob banks. So the basic idea behind the golden rule Kant thought was correct. It's this idea of universalizability, but it needs to be given a more rigorous, a more precise formulation if it's to be a reliable guide to action. The golden rule is not always a reliable guide to morally right action. So Kant took the basic idea behind it and tried to make it, here again, more precise, more rigorous. The basic idea of the principle of universalizability is that an act is morally acceptable if and only if its maxim is universalizable. So as Schaefer-Landau discusses early on in the chapter, a maxim is a rule for acting. You think about, what is it I'm proposing to do? And then you think, what would be the rule that would justify me in doing that? That's what is meant here by a maxim. And then if you could rationally will that that rule should be the universal law, that is to say, the law that everyone follows all the time, if you could will that, then the rule is it is morally permissible to act on that rule. That's the idea. So take this example. What if I am considering disposing of my motor oil? I could, I've changed the oil in my car, and I could take it down to the recycling center. That's one possibility. Or I could just dump it on the ground. Okay, I'm trying to decide what to do. Could I rationally will, so if I were to decide to just dump it on the ground, what rule would I be following? What maxim would I be following? The maxim would be something like, whenever I need to dispose of my motor oil, I will simply dump it on the ground. I can certainly see ways in which that would be advantageous to me. It would save me the inconvenience, the time, and the trouble of going down to the recycling center and disposing of it that way. So it would certainly be convenient. But could I rationally will that should be the universal law that everyone follows that everyone in that same circumstance follows? Well, I couldn't rationally will that, because if everybody did that, then all of the water in the ground would be completely contaminated. So I wouldn't be able to drink water out of the tap. I wouldn't be able to use water out of the tap to cook. And in lots of other ways, of course, my environment, my natural surroundings would be totally ruined, would be totally wrecked, because it would be saturated with motor oil. So I couldn't rationally will that everybody should act on that rule. Well, if I can't will that everybody should act on that rule, then it isn't permissible. It isn't morally right. It isn't morally permissible. What I was proposing to do, dump my motor oil on the ground to save myself the inconvenience of taking it down to the recycling center, that is not morally permissible. How do I know that's not morally permissible? I've applied this principle of universalizability, and I found that I could not universalize such a rule. So Immanuel Kant thought the test of the rightness of an act is this. Again, could you rationally will that the maxim of your action, that is to say the rule that states the reason for your action, could you rationally will that should be a universal law, that should hold as a universal law? If it could, then the action is morally permissible. If it couldn't, then the act is wrong. So that is what is meant here by universalizability. So consequences, as you can see, play no role in this normative theory. Kant's moral philosophy is anti-consequentialist. It's diametrically opposed to what we talked about last week. The utilitarian view is that, as we saw, the goodness or the badness of the consequences, as the case may be, determine whether the act was right or wrong. If the consequences were good, then the act was right. If the consequences were bad, then the act was morally wrong. Kant denies that. Kant denies that the consequences of an act can make it right or wrong. Kant is an anti-consequentialist. As Schaefer-Landau discusses in the chapter, Kant believed very strongly that right and wrong has to do with what is within our control. Rightness can only belong to what's within our control, but consequences are not within our control. Once we act in the world, there are ripple effects to our action. There are reverberations to our action, and they just ripple out in the world in ways that we cannot control. Now, here again, morality has to be about what is within your control. If something happened over which you had no control, then you can't be morally responsible for it. Suppose a meteorite landed in your backyard last night. Are you morally responsible for that fact? Well, there was nothing that you could have done to prevent it. It would be ridiculous to say that person is to be blamed for the fact that there's a meteorite in his backyard. So it's just a bit of moral common sense that morality has to do with what you can control. But here again, the consequences of your action, what happens in the world after you've acted, to a great extent that is not within your control. So this is why Kant was an anti-consequentialist. He felt very strongly that morality has to be about what is within your control. Once you act, the ripple effects of your action, the repercussions of your action in the world, that's all in the world, and the world is not within your control. He believed that the world is deterministic. That is to say, all of the events in the world are already determined. They're already determined by the kinds of causal laws that the physical sciences discover. Everything that's ever going to happen in the physical world is already determined. But Kant also believed that when it comes to our inner lives, we are free. We are not determined. We are free to choose, free to act, free to decide. And so that's really all that you have control over is your mind. At least this was Kant's view. You only have control over your ability to think, your ability to reason, your ability to deliberate. You're weighing different possible courses of action. You think to yourself, I can see the reasons for doing X, but I can also see the reasons for doing Y. And here again, you're going to apply, if you're going to follow the Kantian approach, you're going to apply this test of universalizability, and then you're going to see X is the right act, or Y is the right act, because I couldn't rationally will that X should be a universal law, or I couldn't rationally will that Y should be a universal law. As the case may be, you can think, and that's all that you have control over. You can deliberate, you can ask yourself, what is the right thing to do? What ought I to do? You can weigh the different possible courses of action. You can reflect on the question. All of that goes on in your mind. All of that goes on in your conscience. And that's the one area of our lives where we're free to choose, we're free to decide. But then once you act, acting is through your body in the physical world, and here again, the consequences of that are outside of your control. Again, Kant's view is that morality has to be about what is within your control. It would be ridiculous to blame someone for something over which she had no control. That's just a bit of moral common sense. We don't blame people for things that they could not possibly have prevented. So Kant believed very strongly that morality has to be about what is within your control. Consequences are in the world. They are not within your control. All that you have control over is, here again, your ability to reason, your ability to think, your ability to reflect, deliberate, reflect on this question, what ought I to do? What does the principle of universalizability say is the right thing to do? All that you can do is use your reason. You have freedom to do that. You are free to use your reason, to use your rationality. So one way that Kant explained the idea of a fundamental moral principle on the basis of which you could make all moral decisions in a way that would express this idea of universalizability was to lay down this principle of moral judgment that he called the categorical imperative. So we see there are some similarities between utilitarianism and Kantianism as normative theories, they do both believe that there are fundamental moral laws that we can discover, and on the basis of those fundamental moral laws, we can make moral judgments. We can discover fundamental moral laws on the basis of which, fundamental moral principles, on the basis of which we can make all particular moral judgments. As we saw in the case of utilitarianism, that principle is the principle of utility. Utilitarians say that that is the one fundamental moral principle, the principle of utility. On the basis of that principle, you can make all moral judgments. You can make all particular moral judgments about all particular circumstances, all particular cases. In this unit of the course, we're going to talk about two principles that Kant identified. One is this categorical imperative, and in the next chapter we'll take a look at his idea of the principle of humanity. So they both believed, both philosophical approaches start from the idea that there are one or two fundamental moral principles on the basis of which you can make all particular moral judgments. We've already talked about the principle of utility. We looked at what there was to say on behalf of utilitarianism, as well as what there is to say against it. Let's take a look at what Kant thinks are some fundamental moral principles. One of them he called the categorical imperative, and first let's explain what is meant by this notion of a categorical imperative. An imperative, of course, is a sentence that just tells you what to do. You're familiar with this term, imperative. You're familiar with that term from grammar. There are different kinds of sentences. A sentence might be a question, but a question doesn't tell you what to do. A sentence might be a declarative sentence. It states that something is the case, but again, that doesn't tell you what to do. And then some statements are imperatives, like shut the door, or please open the window. Those are statements, those are sentences that tell you what to do. Now, to explain his fundamental moral principle, Kant talked about a distinction between, on the one hand, hypothetical imperatives, and on the other hand, what he called categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is any imperative that takes this form: if you want A, then do B. If you want X, then do Y. That's the idea. A hypothetical imperative is any statement that tells you what to do in a conditional way, on the basis of a kind of conditional statement, like if you want X, then do Y. So what would be an example? If you want to drive to Abilene, then take 84 South. Okay, that tells you what to do, but it tells you what to do in a conditional way, in a hypothetical way. That is to say, assuming that you want X. In this case, assuming that you want to drive to Abilene. Now, if you don't have the desire to do that, in this case, if you don't have the desire to drive to Abilene, then the imperative doesn't apply to you. It only applies to you in a hypothetical way. It only applies to you in a conditional way. That's the idea of a hypothetical imperative. And of course, there are lots of hypothetical imperatives in life. If you want X, then do Y. Oftentimes, we do reason that way. If you want to drive to Abilene, then take 84 South. We do reason in that way all the time. But when it comes to moral reasoning, Kant said we're involved in using a different kind of imperative, an imperative that doesn't present itself in a hypothetical way, in a conditional way. It doesn't present itself in the form of if you want X, then do Y. If you want A, then do B. A categorical imperative just tells you what you must do. And Kant thought that when it came to all moral truths in a way express a kind of categorical imperative. There is no if you want, when it comes to morality, according to Kant, there is no if you want A, then do B. There just is do B. For example, tell the truth, keep your promises, help others, refrain from harming others, express gratitude, that is to say, show appreciation for what was done for you. All these imperatives are not hypothetical in nature. These imperatives are not conditional. That is to say, an imperative like do what is right. That is categorical. That is not hypothetical. It's not, well, if you want to, then do what is right. No, that's not in the nature of moral thinking, is it? It doesn't matter if you desire to do it. The imperative is categorical. Kant would say that it's a truth of reason that applies to you whether you recognize it or not. So when it comes to moral imperatives, imperatives that tell you what is the right thing to do, those are not hypothetical in nature. They do not depend on what you want. They do not depend on your desires. So Kant's view is that moral truth doesn't depend on what you want. The moral law is a categorical imperative. He believed that it's an objective truth of reason that you are required to act morally, whether you recognize the truth of the moral law or not. Now, of course, as we know, oftentimes people do not do the right thing, and oftentimes people do not even care about whether they're doing the right thing. Of course, that's true. But insofar as they do that, they are acting irrationally, according to Kant, because the categorical imperative is a truth of reason. It's something that applies to you whether you recognize its authority or not, just as any other truth of reason, here again, does not depend on what you believe about it. As we've seen, for utilitarians, the purpose of morality is to bring about as much happiness in the world as possible, and to minimize, so far as possible, the amount of pain and unhappiness in the world. That's a good thing to want, no question. It's a fine thing to want there to be as much happiness in the world as possible. It's a good thing, of course, to want there to be as much happiness in the world as possible, and to want there to be as little pain and unhappiness as possible. But from Kant's point of view, that's not the purpose of morality. That's a fine thing to want, but the purpose of morality doesn't have anything to do, moral truth, let me put it that way, doesn't have anything to do with what we want. There may be lots of ways that we would like to improve the world, but again, what we want is not what morality is about. The purpose of morality, from Kant's point of view, the purpose of morality is justice, fairness, making sure that everyone is treated fairly, justly, making sure that no one's rights are violated, treating people with respect, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, treating everyone as having autonomy, never using another person as a means to an end, always recognizing that the other person is an end in himself or herself. These are the fundamental values of morality for Kant. And none of these have to do with what you want necessarily. You have a duty to treat people. Kant's focus is on duty. You have a duty to treat people fairly, to treat people justly. That is what morality requires. So from the Kantian point of view, the whole starting point for a view like utilitarianism is just mistaken. Morality doesn't depend on what we want. And again, for Kant, it's an objective truth of reason that you are required to act morally, whether you recognize the truth of the moral law or not. And of course, oftentimes people do not act morally, and of course, many people do not recognize the truth of the moral law. But Kant's point of view is, once you reflect on this question, what ought I to do? If you do reflect on that question, as I think most of us do, then there's only one way that you can go from there. You reason your way, according to Kant, to this principle. Ultimately, what I ought to do is what I could rationally will that everyone else should do. That's as we've seen, that's the gist of it. That's the thrust of it. So, the fundamental moral law, according to Kant, or a fundamental moral law on the basis of which you can make all particular moral judgments, according to Kant, is what he called the categorical imperative. So the imperative is, the principle is, act only on that maxim that you could will to hold as a universal law. So basically the same ideas as what I called earlier, the principle of universalizability. The categorical imperative is Kant's way of explaining, his way of expressing the principle of universalizability. You should only perform an act if here again you could rationally will that everyone should act on the same rule that you are proposing to follow yourself. That's the test. That's the categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim that you could will to hold as a universal law. So I gave you an example of that earlier. Let's think about another illustration of the categorical imperative. Kant presented a number of what he called tests of the categorical imperative, and in his writings. And the example that's probably easiest to follow is what he called the test for making a lying promise. That is to say, a promise that you know you won't keep. So it's not a genuine promise. You know you won't keep it, but you make it anyway. So it's kind of a lying promise. So suppose, for example, you need money, and you know that the only way that you can get it is to promise someone that you will repay him. So you know someone who will give you the money, and you need the money. You know someone who will give it to you, but you know he will only give it to you if you promise to repay him by Friday, let's say. Okay. So you're contemplating what to do. I need the money, so I could make a lying promise. That's the only way that I would get it. So I could make a lying promise. That is to say, a promise that I know I won't be able to keep. Ought I to do that? Kant says, if you reflect and ask yourself, here again this question, what ought I to do? Our moral reason leads us to the insight that, here again, as we said with respect to the categorical imperative, you should act only on that maxim, that is to say, only on that rule that you could will to hold as a universal law. So act only on that rule that you could wish to be the universal rule. That is to say, the same rule that everyone follows in the same circumstance. Could you do that in this case? Well, in this case, Kant would say, you can't rationally will that your maxim, in this case your rule would be, well, to get myself out of a difficulty, I'll lie. I'll make a lying promise. Could you rationally will that maxim should be a universal law? That is to say, everyone act on the principle. When I need to do so in order to get myself out of a difficulty, I'll lie, or I'll make a lying promise. Could you rationally will that should be the universal law? Well, if it were a universal law, there would be no such thing as the social convention of promising, because no one would regard promises as binding, so there would be no point to it, would there? Promises wouldn't exist. If it were understood that I promise doesn't bind you to anything in the future, if it were understood that the words I promise didn't, here again, commit you to a certain course of action that you were required to follow, if everybody understood the words I promise as just meaning something like, well, if I want to, later when the time comes, if I feel like it or something like that, then of course nobody would regard promises as binding. And if they're not binding, then there's no point to them, is there? So promises would just go out of existence. So what Kant is saying is that when you apply this test of the categorical imperative, what you will find in the case of immoral acts that are not morally permissible, what you will find is that there's a kind of contradiction involved. And that contradiction shows the wrongness of that way of acting. The contradiction in this case is here again. Would you be able to get, let me start that again. In a world in which everybody acted on that rule, would you be able to get what you wanted when you first adopted that rule? Here again, the rule, the maxim in this case, is to get myself out of a difficulty, I'll make a lying promise. Okay. What is your point in adopting that rule? Your point in adopting that rule would be to get the money. But then you apply this test of the categorical imperative. What if everyone followed that same rule? As we just said, promises would go out of existence. So in that world, in the world in which everybody acted on that rule, that maxim, it wouldn't be possible to get the money by making a promise, would it? So there would be a kind of contradiction involved if you were to try to adopt that as your maxim. If you were to adopt that as your rule, there would be a kind of contradiction involved in that. You would be behaving in an irrational way, according to Kant. Ultimately, the categorical imperative is a kind of truth of reason. It's a kind of truth of rationality. It's a kind of truth, it's a true principle that you can grasp simply in virtue of the fact that you have reason, that you have rationality. And once you apply this test to the maxim, to the rule that you were considering adopting, you see that there's a kind of contradiction involved from the point of view of rationality. Here again, from the point of view of what's rational to do. You see that there's a kind of contradiction involved. And that shows that making a lying promise is not morally permissible. Okay, so Schaefer-Landau presents Kant's ideas on universalizability and the categorical imperative. But he ultimately finds that the categorical imperative, too, is not entirely reliable. I said earlier that Kant thought that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, treat others the way you want to be treated. I said earlier that Kant thought that the basic idea behind that principle was correct. It was the idea of universalizability, but he thought that it needed to be given, the golden rule needed to be given a more precise, a more rigorous formulation. Because it's not that hard to think of counterexamples to that, things that would be consistent with the golden rule, but that would seem to be clearly wrong. So I gave an example of that earlier. Kant thought that the categorical imperative was more precise, a more rigorous statement of the same idea. So again, the categorical imperative is act only on that maxim that you could will to hold as a universal law. So he thinks this more rigorous principle takes the basic idea behind the golden rule and makes it more precise. But Schaefer-Landau finds, and other philosophers have found, that that principle fails. It still allows acts that are clearly wrong. So Schaefer-Landau gives this example: in order to preserve my lawn, I will shoot anyone who steps on it. Okay, if such a maxim were adopted, it would be possible to achieve one's goal. What was your goal in adopting that maxim? Your goal was to keep anyone from stepping on your lawn. In a world in which everybody followed that rule, would you be able to achieve your goal of no one stepping on your lawn? Yes, you would. So there wouldn't be any contradiction. And yet, it seems clear that it would be wrong to shoot someone simply for stepping on your lawn. So the universalizability principle, the categorical imperative, seems to fail because it doesn't rule out what would clearly be a wrong act. So even Kant's more rigorous, more precise formulation of the principle of universalizability still is not entirely reliable as a guide to action. Okay, well, let's talk about one further point that Schaefer-Landau brings up in his presentation of Kant in this chapter. And then there's a second chapter on Kant, and we're going to talk about another principle that Kant identified, another moral principle that Kant discussed in the next chapter. And we're going to talk about some of his other ideas in the next chapter. But one more point in this chapter. As Schaefer-Landau points out, many have found the Kantian moral philosophy persuasive because of its emphasis on integrity. To many, it doesn't seem right that you should abandon your principles any time you could maximize good consequences by doing so. That isn't a life of principled moral conviction. What we mean by integrity here is that if you have a moral conviction, kind of moral principle that you live your life by, then it's an important trait of character that you stick to it. It's a virtue that you stick to that principle even when it's difficult, even when adhering to that principle, sticking to that moral conviction, sticking to that moral rule might not bring about the most happiness. Maybe if you went against some moral principle that you hold as a conviction, maybe in some circumstance, if you went against it, more people would be happy. But is that a life with integrity? Is that a life of moral integrity? Just disregarding what you had regarded as a moral conviction, a strongly held moral principle. If you just dispense with it any time it's convenient to do so, anytime you could maximize good consequences by disregarding it, is that a life of principled moral conviction? A lot of philosophers have thought, no, it is not, and that is what they see as a serious problem with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism does not attach proper moral importance to the virtue of integrity. Kant's moral philosophy does, and for that reason many have found it to be a persuasive normative theory. This integrity objection to utilitarianism was put this way by Bernard Williams. Bernard Williams was a 20th century British philosopher who was quite critical of utilitarianism. And he put the point this way. He asked, how can a man, as a utilitarian agent, come to regard as one satisfaction among others, and a dispensable one, a project or attitude around which he has built his life, just because someone else's projects have so structured the causal scene that that is how the utilitarian sum comes out? All right, so what might be an example of that kind? I have an example of that kind from Bernard Williams' writings. So let me read it to you. Let me read to you this scenario, and then here again say a little bit more about Williams' ideas about integrity. So imagine this scenario. Jim finds himself in the central square of a small South American town. Tied up against the wall are a row of 20 Indians, mostly terrified, a few defiant. In front of them, several armed men in uniform. A heavy man in sweat-stained khaki shirts turns out to be the captain in charge, and after a good deal of questioning of Jim, which establishes that he got there by accident while on a botanical expedition, explains that the Indians are a random group of inhabitants who, after recent acts of protest against the government, are just about to be killed to remind other possible protesters of the advantages of not protesting. However, since Jim is an honored visitor from another land, the captain is happy to offer him a guest's privilege of killing one of the Indians himself. If Jim accepts, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other Indians will be let off. Of course, if Jim refuses, then there is no special occasion, and Pedro will do what he was about to do when Jim arrived, and kill them all. Jim, with some desperate recollection of schoolboy fiction, wonders whether, if he got hold of a gun, he could hold the captain and the rest of the soldiers to threat, but it is quite clear from the setup that nothing of that kind is going to work. Any attempt of that sort of thing will mean that all the Indians will be killed, and himself. The men against the wall, the other villagers, understand the situation and are begging him to accept. So, what should he do? Okay, so that's what Bernard Williams meant when he said, why should you dispense with your principles just because someone else's projects have so structured the causal scene that that is how the utilitarian sum comes out? That is to say, in this scenario, if you comply with the request of this evil person and kill one of the Indians, kill one of the randomly chosen, just innocent Indians. Here again, they've been chosen randomly just to terrorize the population into not opposing the government. But here again, in this scenario, this evil person tells you, well, if you kill one of them, then I'll let the rest go. Okay, in that scenario, there clearly is a course of action that would maximize good consequences. Only one would die as opposed to all of them dying. That certainly is an act that minimizes bad consequences. And that certainly is the act that would do the most to save the number of lives that can be saved in that scenario. Here again, as I just read in the scenario, there's no way out of it. If you try to resist, then they'll just kill them all and kill you. So that's the only option. Again, that's not an option. The options are comply with the request, and that will maximize good consequences, or do not comply with the request, and that will not maximize good consequences, because then he'll kill them all. There clearly is a course of action that would maximize good consequences, but Williams's point was that if a man has built his life around the value, or let's say the attitude, as he puts it here, that it's intrinsically wrong to take innocent human life, then it's not a life of, here again, principled moral integrity to just disregard that principle because now some evil person has arranged things such that you must disregard that principle if you want to maximize good consequences. That's not a life of integrity. Here again, as William said, how can a man as a utilitarian agent regard as one satisfaction among others and a dispensable one an attitude around which he built his life, just because someone else's projects have so structured the scene that is how the calculation of good and bad consequences comes out? That's not a life of integrity. That's not a life of principled moral integrity, according to Williams. So this is a broadly Kantian perspective. Here again, in the sense that sometimes it's hard to do the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing might not bring about the most happiness. But from the Kantian point of view, it's important that we have integrity. It's important that we stick to our moral convictions. It's important that we stick to our moral principles, even when doing that will not bring about the greatest happiness, even when doing that will not maximize happiness. That's what it is to have moral integrity, to stick to your moral principles even when that is hard to do, even when it won't make the most people happy. But without integrity, it's arguably the case that one is not a good person. So Williams is expressing this broadly Kantian idea that ultimately there are things when it comes to morality that are more important than the consequences, good or bad. It's ultimately more important that you be a certain kind of person, namely a person of moral integrity. And this value of integrity, which I think many people see as indeed very important, as essential to being a good, morally good person, is not a value in utilitarianism. It just isn't. Utilitarians say do whatever will maximize good consequences. Nothing is intrinsically right or wrong other than the principle of utility. So here again, quite a different perspective, quite a different point of view on morality from what we saw in utilitarianism. So two fundamentally opposed views, fundamental divergence of views here, and you'll have to decide for yourself what to think about that. You'll have to think for yourself and decide for yourself what you think is the more plausible, the more believable, the more credible theory of right.